right, let's jump straight into this explainer. We are diving into the literal perfect storm of historical events that completely transformed our world. We're talking about the massive leap from simple mercantile trade to the towering, cinematic industrial landscape of the 19th century. If you've ever looked around at the absolute mountain of goods we rely on today and wondered, how exactly we went from small-scale farming to mass production, well, you're in the right place.
It's a colossal question, right? Figuring out how human production shifted so drastically in just a few short centuries. We are looking at a transformation that completely rewired not just how we make our stuff, but how we think, how we talk, and how our entire society is structured.
So, to answer that, here is our roadmap for today. We'll quickly cover early mercantile capitalism, the joint stock innovation, defining industrial capitalism, Britain's unique advantages, the agricultural revolution, and finally wrap up with culture and class conflict. Let's get to it.
Okay, Section 1, Early Mercantile Capitalism. For this, I want you to picture a lone rug merchant way back in the year 1200 CE. Keep in mind, this isn't the capitalism of sprawling factories and smokestacks. This is the very beginning.
As you can see on this timeline, mercantile capitalism was a global baseline long before factories were ever a thing. Whether we're talking about Chinese merchants, the bustling Indian Ocean trade networks, or Muslim merchants sponsoring massive caravans across the Sahara, the basic premise was exactly the same. You borrow some money, you buy goods, like our merchants' rugs, you resell them at a profit, and you pay back the loan, usually with interest. It worked brilliantly, for sure, but it was strictly limited to moving things that already existed. That limitation brings us to Section 2, the joint stock innovation. The intense risks of that early international trade basically forced the next major leap, spearheaded mostly by merchants in the 17th century Netherlands and Britain. Imagine you fund a huge trade mission. If your boat sinks or gets attacked by pirates, you lose absolutely everything. Game over. But what if you own just 10% of 10 different boats? That brilliant little innovation is how early capitalists managed risk. If one boat goes down, you only lose a tiny fraction of your investment. This joint stock model was an absolute game changer, allowing for much larger trade missions and, obviously, a lot more wealth. Moving right along to Section 3, defining industrial capitalism. Now, while those joint stock companies were great for protecting wealth, they didn't actually change how things were made. And that brings us to the core traits of industrial capitalism. The absolute crucial shift to understand here is the contrast. We're moving away from simply transporting goods for profit, and we're starting to invest heavily in massive churning machines that mass produce items. It goes from just moving stuff to making exponentially more stuff. Historian Joyce Appleby hits the nail on the head with this definition. She anchors the idea that capital was suddenly being used to physically multiply human output. You aren't just buying a rug anymore, you are investing in a machine that can crank out 10 times the number of rugs. It takes a big upfront investment, sure, but the scale of production is totally unprecedented.
Which leads us to Section 4, Britain's unique advantages. So, why did this massive technological explosion happen primarily in 19th century Britain? Why not somewhere else on the globe?
Well, it was literally a historical perfect storm. Britain had this highly specific cocktail of advantages that basically primed the engine of industry. First off, they were the dominant power on the seas, so global trade was incredibly efficient for them. Second, they were pulling in massive wealth from colonial trade, which undeniably included the slave trade. And third, which is kind of surprising, they actually had freer markets because of the 17th century English Civil War. During that whole half-century of chaos, the British Crown just couldn't enforce its complicated royal monopolies, which accidentally created a vastly more open and deregulated economy. But here's the catch, and we cover this in Section 5, the agricultural revolution. None of those awesome trade advantages would have mattered at all without the true unsung hero of the industrial age. Let's walk through this positive feedback loop because it's fascinating. It starts with better farming, heavily influenced by the Dutch, like planting clover. Clover pumps nitrogen back into the soil, meaning you can farm more fields at once. More crops mean food prices drop. Because food is suddenly cheaper, English workers, who already had relatively decent wages, suddenly have disposable income. And what do they do with it? They buy stuff. This huge spike in demand for consumer goods heavily incentivized capitalists to build factories so they could produce those goods as cheaply and quickly as possible. To put that demographic shift into perspective, look at these numbers. Back in 1520, a whopping 80% of the English population worked the land just to keep everyone fed. But by 1850, as farming became wildly efficient, that number plummeted to just 25%. This meant a massive labor force was suddenly freed up, or in many cases, pushed off the land, leaving them totally available to go work the brand new industrial machines in the cities. Finally, let's look at Section 6, Culture and Class Conflict. Because this wasn't just a physical shift in machinery, it literally required a total rewiring of human culture, which, as you might guess, sparked some pretty intense conflicts. Just listen to this quote from John Kerry back in 1695. He was one of the early cheerleaders for capitalism. This is the radical moment when society starts viewing human beings primarily as consumers, believing that our, quote, exorbitant appetite for manufactured goods could actually be the engine of economic growth. That was a profound, mind-bending shift. Before this, just wanting to consume more stuff wasn't exactly seen as a virtue. Even the very words we use had to evolve to catch up with this. Think about this. The word individuals wasn't even applied to actual people until the 17th century. And actually, scratch that whole modern idea of climbing the corporate ladder, because in the 18th century, if you said you had a career, people would assume you were talking about a horse's racing life. The cultural transformation was just absolute. But if we impartially examine the critiques that followed from thinkers like Karl Marx, we see the darker side. Industrial capitalism generated some truly brutal working conditions and a deep structural divide. As Marx pointed out, the system basically created two distinct classes based on what they owned. Capitalists owned the factories and naturally wanted to pay the lowest possible labor costs. Workers owned nothing but their own labor and naturally wanted the highest possible pay. It created an inherent conflict over production, replacing natural collaboration with a deep-seated structural struggle. So as we wrap up this explainer, we're left staring down this incredibly massive, lingering question. There is no denying that industrial capitalism won out when it comes to global material wealth and producing goods. But the debate over how and how much we should regulate these free markets is still wide open today. From healthcare to education, it's a conversation we're still deeply engaged in. So I will leave you with this to think about. As our modern world continues to innovate at lightning speed, how will we choose to balance this relentless drive to produce with the fundamental well-being of the actual people?